On April 12, 1963, 2 weeks after the birth of his fourth child, Dr. King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and 1,000 others marched toward downtown Birmingham. The marchers were in deliberate violation of an order by Police Commissioner Bull Connor expressly forbidding demonstrations. The mass arrests began. As expected, King and Abernathy were arrested and jailed along with many others. King was held for 24 hours in solitary confinement until President Kennedy personally interceded with Birmingham officials. On May 2, 1963, a large group of black children joined the Birmingham protests. After a speech by King, they moved toward downtown. Again, the police began making arrests. The same buses that transported the children to segregated schools were now being used to haul them to segregated prisons. Before the day was over, almost 1,000 children were in jail. A day later, another 1,000 children joined the march. This time, the authorities resorted to violence. The marchers were blasted with fire hoses, beaten with clubs, attacked by police dogs, and gassed. At last, on May 10, 1963, under pressure from the federal government and from outraged world opinion, the leaders of Birmingham accepted the demands of the Freedom Marchers. Having witnessed the abuse of power by Alabama authorities to the humiliating images of American violence and injustice being spread throughout the world, President Kennedy had seen enough.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Kennedy agreed to push landmark civil rights legislation through Congress.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
In June, Dr. King and civil rights leaders met with the president to announce plans for a march on Washington in support of the Civil Rights Act. The historic March on Washington took place in August 1963. As King and the others predicted, enormous numbers, black and white, gathered to show the time had come to end the discriminatory treatment of black Americans.
We, through our struggles, through our suffering, through our sacrifice, will be able to achieve the American dream. And this will be the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
The day was a landmark in American history, and the high point was a speech by Dr. King that stands as one of the most important, beautiful, eloquent, and stirring orations in the English language. That day, King told of his dream of equality for his children, his people, and his nation. King's words made many Americans feel free for the first time in their lives. In September, less than a month after the march, a black church was bombed in Birmingham during Sunday services. 4 young girls were killed. As always, King deplored the violence, but he urged his followers not to stoop to violence themselves. But freedom marchers and civil rights advocates were not the only ones to experience violence. As President Kennedy at last committed himself to passage of the Civil Rights Act, his popularity dropped dramatically. President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived by plane in Dallas. They began a motorcade in open limousines into the heart of the city. And there in Dallas, John F. Kennedy was shot and killed. President Johnson, a Southerner, was much cooler toward King and the civil rights agenda than Kennedy had been. But he pledged to complete Kennedy's work on the Civil Rights Act. He knew even better than Kennedy how to achieve consensus on legislation. One of Johnson's first and greatest achievements was passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This bill was the most important civil rights legislation signed into law since the 15th Constitutional Amendment of 1870. It guaranteed the right to vote to all male citizens without regard to race, color, or previous enslavement. The new federal law of 1964 prohibited discrimination for reasons of color, race, religion, or national origin in public schools and employment. Dr. King, for his leadership, was named Time magazine's 1964 Man of the Year. And later in 1964, he became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. But passage of the Civil Rights Act did not mean that the struggle was over. Violence against the movement continued to rage. Bombings, burnings, and killings were regular events throughout the South.